Beijing warns NATO against stirring up confrontation as the Western Defense Alliance wraps up a three-day summit in Washington. Hello, I'm Anton, and this is The Heat. Beijing rejected claims made by NATO this week that China is a, quote, enabler of Russia's military action in Ukraine. Foreign Minister Wang Yi dismissed the accusation as groundless and reiterated Beijing's commitment to international peace and stability. The Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs also issued a strongly worded statement.
Immediately after the Ukraine crisis broke out, the US falsely claimed that China was providing military support to Russia. Until this day, the US has not offered any substantial evidence. Even US military chiefs have admitted that China did not provide military assistance to Russia in the Ukraine crisis.
With the NATO summit now wrapped up in Washington, CGTN's Jim Spellman has details on the three-day gathering.
The final day of the NATO summit focused largely on Ukraine and boosting European defense. Short term, that means U.S. F-16 fighter jets in the air by the end of the summer, flown by Ukrainian pilots, and more military aid to Ukraine. Moves welcomed by Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, who sat down with President Joe Biden on Thursday.
Ukraine will prevail, and I want you to know we're going to be with you every step of the way. 2 days ago, I announced a historic donation of air defense equipment to Ukraine. Today, I'm proud to announce a new security systems package for Ukraine. This will be the 8th package I've authorized since we've signed the national security bill.
Moscow warns the F-16s and other weapons flowing into Ukraine will only prolong the conflict.
Good morning.
Longer term, the U.S. has committed to placing cruise missiles on the ground in Germany by 2026, and NATO is looking toward Ukraine joining the alliance. The summit declaration released Wednesday provides for a, quote, irreversible path to full Euro-Atlantic integration, including NATO membership, but no timeline has been set.
We have strong warning regarding the irreversibility of Ukraine's movement towards NATO. Every step truly brings us closer to membership. We are doing and will continue to do everything to ensure that the day comes when Ukraine is invited and becomes a NATO member, and I am confident we will achieve this.
The summit wrapped with most members agreeing NATO is on solid ground. There's broad agreement about supporting Ukraine. A majority of member countries now spend at least 2% of their GDP on defense, and Sweden and Finland are new members.
Often there has been concerns about whether new governments, new political parties will support NATO. And of course in democracies you don't have any guarantees, but the reality is that NATO has proven extremely resilient because every time they have a new party or a new government, they realize that every NATO ally is safer in NATO than outside NATO.
But the alliance faces an uncertain future, depending largely on whether the U.S. presidential election is won by NATO skeptic Donald Trump, NATO supporting Joe Biden, or another Democrat. This is the last summit for NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg. He's held the position since 2014. The former Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte will take over on October 1st. Jim Spellman, CGTN, Washington.
Right, to discuss what's happened, let's bring in our guests. Joining us here in Washington, D.C., Anton Fedyashin is a professor of history at American University. From New York, we're joined by Maté. He is the host of Pushback with Maté on the Grayzone. From Virginia, we're joined by Michael Maloof. He is a former senior Pentagon strategic analyst. And from Beijing, we're joined by Einar Tangen. He is a senior fellow at the Taihe Institute and chairman of Asia Narratives. Welcome to all of you. Einar Tangen, we just saw the outgoing NATO Secretary General, Jens Stoltenberg, there in that report. He is NATO's outgoing Secretary General. He went after China at this NATO summit, and as we had been saying, he accused Beijing of being an enabler of Russia's war in Ukraine. And we just heard the response from the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson saying that it's groundless and that NATO has not provided any evidence of these accusations that they're making. But this is the first time that NATO as a group went after China in this way. What do you make of that?
Well, NATO is concerned about the fact that they're losing on the ground. They weren't prepared for the kind of asymmetrical warfare. They were assuming that Western munitions would take care of the day. Now they need an excuse to say, why things haven't turned out the way they thought. Russia's economy is doing better than the U.S. and Europe's, and B, this issue about the war. So right now it's point fingers at China and declare that China's the reason that they're losing a conflagration that they created.
There was also some kind of warning from NATO that there would be as yet unspecified action taken against China. Could that mean sanctions, more sanctions against China?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there will be more people, more companies, individuals added to the blacklist. This is, the old playbook. It continues. They will try to, without providing any kind of evidence, say that China is helping the war effort. China has been very, very, very careful about not being in that position. Yeah. If they wanted to support wholeheartedly, they could have very easily. And this issue is just one that's being manufactured.
Anton Fedyashin, NATO also released the Washington Summit Declaration, which stated that, and I'm quoting here, Russia remains the most significant and direct threat to allies' security, unquote. In fact, the U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin said, quote, Putin's war is not the result of NATO enlargement. Putin's war is the cause of NATO enlargement. It seems that there was a lot of effort being put into stirring up a lot of fear about Russia. What's the NATO strategy here?
The strategy is exactly what you said, to stoke fear, because that's what keeps the alliance moving along. It's what feeds the military-industrial complex in the West, and it's what consolidates democracy. During the Cold War, Anton, one of the great benefits of having an existential enemy in the face of communism was the consolidating factor that it had for the United States domestically and for Western Europe. Since the end of the Cold War, since the early 1990s, that consolidating factor of an existential threat, an ideological threat, and an identifiable one disappeared. And we've seen a lot of domestic instability, especially in the United States, sort of the unraveling of the government/society consensus. And now, with NATO's relentless expansion towards Russia, that existential enemy is being projected right back onto where it was during the generation of Joe Biden and a good chunk of the leaders that surround him. So fear makes a very good mobilizing force. It makes NATO a wonderful business for the military-industrial complexes of its members. And so as long as there are trillions of dollars at stake over decades, I don't foresee any of this changing, unfortunately, for Ukraine first and foremost, because NATO's not actually doing any fighting, but it's the weapons industries in the West are making a lot of money, but it's the Ukrainians who are dying along with the Russians on the battlefield of Ukraine.
Right, Anton, one other point. We heard from the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, as well as other delegates at the NATO gathering, that Ukraine will become a member of NATO. And I'm wondering, do you believe that will happen? Because if Ukraine does become a member of NATO, Russia has no incentive to stop the conflict, does it?
No, it doesn't. And this is really a stunning and bloody carrot that is being dangled before Ukraine. You guys keep fighting because victory in this war is the condition under which you will join NATO. This has been, by the way, stated publicly during this summit. Until you have won, no membership. But then, of course, NATO will have to deal with the territorial question because, as a rule, NATO does not accept members who have territorial disputes with other countries for the obvious reason that the whole alliance doesn't want to be dragged into local conflicts.
Right.
But that's exactly what I'm afraid is going to happen, because I do not see, unfortunately for the Ukrainians, any way that they can reconquer any of the territory that the Russians currently hold.
Aaron, great to see you. The conflict in Ukraine was, of course, very high on the agenda at this three-day gathering of NATO leaders, and we heard that there's going to be more support for Ukraine, and that support includes U.S. fighter planes and an undertaking, as we just discussed, that Ukraine will become at some stage a member of NATO. There was one dissenting voice, though. Hungary's Foreign Minister, Peter Szijjártó, said Ukrainian membership in NATO will weaken unity, not strengthen it in the alliance. And we heard nothing about any kind of diplomatic effort to resolve the conflict between Ukraine and Russia. We only heard about war. What do you believe is NATO's goal here?
NATO's goal, to me, is what was stated openly by Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin and later on Jake Sullivan. The goal here is to use Ukraine to weaken Russia, or in Sullivan's words, to hand Russia a strategic defeat. They never talk about, when they talk about their real goals, actually defending Ukraine in the short term and also defending its long-term well-being. Because the point of this invitation to Ukraine to NATO, under the guise of the so-called open door, has been basically to grant NATO a backdoor through which to fight Russia. Because by promising Ukraine future membership somewhere in the future, you can use that as an excuse to integrate Ukraine into NATO's military infrastructure, which has happened over the last 8 years, especially since the U.S. backed a coup in Ukraine, without the obligation to defend Ukraine if it comes under attack, which is exactly what has happened. And I see no alteration from that course. The rejection of diplomacy is especially malicious, given we know there have been so many tangible diplomatic opportunities to avoid all this carnage in Ukraine. Before Russia invaded, it put out a draft peace treaty to NATO and the U.S., premised on the principle of neutrality for Ukraine and a rollback of NATO infrastructure surrounding Russia. The U.S. basically refused to discuss the main points. After Russia invaded, Ukraine and Russia reached a peace deal in Turkey, or at least the outlines of one, that addressed all these issues. It was premised, again, on neutrality for Ukraine. But we know from leaks starting from the Ukrainian delegation that Boris Johnson came over, presumably on behalf of the U.S., and told Ukraine that the West would not back Ukraine up if it made peace with Russia. And that's because the overriding goal was not to defend Ukraine, it was to bleed Russia. And therefore, more than 2 years later, here we are now with hundreds of thousands of dead and no end to this carnage in sight.
Michael Maloof, NATO was initially created as a collective alliance after World War II against what was then the Soviet Union. Of course, the Soviet Union is no more. It doesn't exist anymore. It was broken up after the end of the Cold War. That was in 1990. So what relevance does NATO have in today's world? Does it make today's world a more secure place, or does it make the likelihood of conflict even greater?
Well, thanks for having me, and to your other panel members. NATO has outlived its usefulness. NATO was designed initially during the Cold War as a defensive alliance. It's now become an offensive alliance. We saw it in then Yugoslavia. We saw it in Libya. We're now seeing it in Ukraine. And then and now it's expanded to the Russian border. The problem here is that it's outlived its usefulness, and the fact that it's looking for a mission, it's now trying to look to the Pacific, and it's a Trojan horse. And you have already members even in Asia that are beginning to pull back on that notion. For example, some missiles were taken out of the Philippines because the Philippines said, we don't want them, because of China. They don't want to irritate and agitate China, but that's precisely what the United States wants to do. And they want to bring in Australia. Now, even Australia has said, look, we don't need to have that kind of NATO presence in the area. So the question, and they've also, and if you listen to Stoltenberg, he was talking about looking at into the Arctic, into outer space, and then as well as the Pacific. Again, it's NATO looking for a mission. It has outlived its usefulness, and even the fact that Ukraine wants to join NATO, and NATO is pushing that narrative. That is absolutely against the 1990 proclamation that created Ukraine in the first place. There is a section there that talks about their non-alignment. And we have violated every one of the agreements of indivisibility as a result of NATO expansion over time. And as a consequence, we can no longer be trusted on any agreements that we ever want to enter into the future.
Anna Tangen, just looking at that point that was raised there by Michael, with NATO having difficulty finding why it should exist and its relevance in the North Atlantic, which is in its name, so it's now starting to look beyond the North Atlantic region. Here's China's Foreign Ministry spokesperson Lin Jian again. Let's listen to him.
The NATO is extending its hand to the Asia-Pacific region, strengthening its military and security ties with China's neighboring countries and allies of the U.S., and aligning with the U.S. in implementing the Indo-Pacific strategy. Its moves have undermined China's interests and jeopardized peace and stability in the Asia-Pacific region, which has aroused doubts and opposition from regional countries.
So, Einar, we have Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. They were all invited to the summit. Where do you see this heading?
Well, Anton, I mean, this is kind of a slow step where the U.S. is trying to transfer the cost of policing the world to as many people as many countries as they possibly can. The difficulty here is there's no end game. NATO expands. Eventually, it becomes too much. And as a result, there is either a conflict or dissolves internally because of the cost. You have to remember, all these leaders, elites, saying that they want to put 2% of their GDP into defense spending. That's not sitting well with ordinary people who are really hurting right now. They want the emphasis to be on domestic development, taking care of social issues. So at some point, this either fails on its own or it causes something that's irreversible.
Anton, the relationship between NATO and Russia, it's a relationship that was not always one of hostility. In fact, Russia was the first country to join NATO's Partnership for Peace, that is, as it was called then. So how did this relationship deteriorate to the point where we now have NATO, effectively fighting a proxy war against Russia?
Anand, the NATO expansion during the 1990s, starting in the 1990s and then continuing all the way up to today, is the reason for the breakdown of that relationship. We are now finding out from released diplomatic documents that even when Boris Yeltsin was the president of Russia in the 1990s, and the first bout of NATO expansion was happening into Eastern Europe, the Russians agreed to it, joined the Partnership for Peace, but did so grudgingly because, as Yeltsin admitted, as documents from the National Security Archive just released this past week showed, the Russians were certainly not happy, but there was absolutely nothing that they could do. And so the expansion continued. Look, any country that has an alliance, a military alliance, expanding towards its borders relentlessly for 20 years will object to this. We have the perfect example in the Cuban Missile Crisis from 1962, how the United States reacted when just 90 miles off of its border in 1962, the Kennedy administration discovered that the Soviets were putting medium-range ballistic missiles onto Cuba. Back then, John F. Kennedy, a young, still untested president, stood up for the United States because this was seen as an existential risk, although no one in their right mind thought that the Soviet Union was about to pounce on the United States with nuclear weapons. And yet, that was a vital national security issue. All sorts of international law was broken in order to prevent the Soviets from placing more missiles on Cuba, including what was called a quarantine, but was essentially a blockade. in international waters. And guess what? The American population, when push came to shove, supported their president for the perfectly understandable reason that this was an important issue. The same thing has been happening, except to the Russians, for the past 20 years. So sooner or later, this was going to devolve into a crisis. Unfortunately for Ukraine, it fell to Ukraine to become not a buffer state, which would have kept it at peace and kept it profiting from being a bridge between the EU and Russia, even if it were a member of the EU itself. But it turned the country into a battleground. Yeah. So in the tectonic geopolitical shift that we're living through, Ukraine ended up positioning itself right on the fault line, and that's the cause for the tragedy that we're seeing unfold.
Aaron Maté, Jacobin magazine quoted the former United States ambassador to what was then the Soviet Union, Jack Matlock, as saying back in 2022 that there would be no basis for the current crisis that we are seeing right now had there been no expansion of the alliance. And he also, that was at the end of the Cold War. And he also said that it's policies pursued by Presidents Clinton, Bush, Obama, Trump, and Biden that have brought us to this point. Does he have a point?
He does, and he's one of many veteran U.S. officials at the highest levels who have warned about the dangers of NATO expansion ever since the 1990s, and they've been ignored by the people in power in Washington. He's far from alone in that. And we should point out that this expansion of NATO has occurred alongside a dismantling, began especially by George W. Bush, of arms control treaties that keep the peace between the U.S. and Russia. Bush, at the behest of John Bolton, pulled out of the ABM Treaty, which is a vital Cold War-era pact. He then passed the baton to Donald Trump, who brought back John Bolton, and John Bolton then presided over the dismantling of the INF Treaty, which was a vital Cold War treaty that had basically eliminated thousands of nuclear weapons in Europe between the U.S. and Russia. And Trump pulled out of that treaty. The official reason from the Trump administration was that Russia was in violation. We all know that that was a lie. That, to the extent there was a dispute, it could have been worked out within the mechanisms established by the INF. But the real reason was that the U.S. wanted to not only threaten Russia, but also wanted to threaten China. And because of that, these are issues that Russia tried to address in its draft treaty to the U.S. and NATO of December 2021. But the U.S. basically refused to discuss all of the core issues. And right now, what has just happened at the NATO summit, the U.S. and Germany have announced that because the INF treaty is no longer enforced thanks to Trump, they're going to deploy the same missiles that were previously banned under the INF treaty inside Germany. And Russia said it already will respond. So we're headed even further into the danger zone. And it's just incredible that despite the fact that these are Republicans and the Democrats, this Cold War policy, it's supposed to be a relic of a different era, it's very much still in effect. And it's a threat to us all.
Michael Maloof, one of the most important articles of the NATO Charter is the article which states that an attack on one is an attack on all. It was that article that was invoked by the United States in the wake of the 9/11 attacks that took NATO to Afghanistan. But there were many, many wars after 9/11 in those subsequent wars against Muslim countries that led to the deaths. And this is something that's not being reported very often. It led to the deaths of at least 4.5 million people. That's direct and indirect threats. That's according to the Costs of War project, which is being done by Brown University here in the United States. In addition to that, 38 million people have been displaced. They've been made refugees. So what do you make of that NATO legacy as they say, celebrate 75 years?
Well, it underscores my original point, that it has become an offensive organization. And we're already seeing cracks in that so-called unity of 32 countries, Turkey, Hungary, and Slovakia now. They're beginning to have second thoughts about all this. They're not unanimous. And in fact, Orban, the president of Hungary, was basically shunned by Stoltenberg at the latest meeting, and so he flew on down to Mar-a-Lago. So there's not unity, and I think what we're seeing here is the beginning of the end of NATO as a unified structure, and already NATO is bracing to try to become prepared for Trump, and I think that if they try to do this, Trump is going to hold them accountable. And I think what we're seeing evolve here is a NATO that's probably going to begin to split off and splinter a little bit. Already you have Macron talking about a Western defense system as opposed to a NATO. You have major non-NATO country alliances, let's say in the Maghreb and North Africa. They all are associated with NATO, but they're not NATO per se. But we're going to be seeing these more regional events begin to take place. But I think we saw Libya was the prime example. So was Iraq. These were you still had participation of the so-called willing. Yeah. It wasn't a unified NATO effort as it was after 9/11 into Afghanistan. Afghanistan was the only time that NATO, as an entity, responded that way. All the other crises were countries of the willing.
Yeah. Anton, very quickly, I've got about a minute left here. I want to get back to that point that was raised earlier on the decision by NATO at this meeting to deploy short-range and intermediate-range missiles in Germany. Now, the United States already has missile sites in Poland and Romania as well. I mean, that led to the director of the Russian Academy of Sciences Institute for Europe, whose name is Andrei Gromyko. He said that if that happens, the situation in Europe will probably put the world on the brink of World War III.
Gromyko is, of course, dramatizing events, but there's a kernel of truth in his words. The deployment of intermediate range and cruise missiles is simply going to roll us right back to the beginning of the 1980s when the Reagan administration deployed the Pershings in Europe. It will have two effects. The Russians will respond in kind, which Vladimir Putin has officially already stated will happen. And number two, it will spark a very powerful anti-nuclear movement in Europe itself, which the Russians will then attempt to manipulate, just as the Soviets did in the 1980s, in order to create cracks within Western governments and within the NATO alliance. I think that ultimately and conceptually, sort of philosophically speaking, this is an attempt to replay the end of the Cold War and to win it again. Unfortunately, I don't think that the correlation of forces, as the Soviets used to say back then, is on the Western side.
Okay, and that is where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anton in Washington, D.C.